Everyone knows what a medieval manor was. You've seen it 100 times. Stone walls, a keep, a gate you could bar against an army, a lord in furs standing on a rampart while peasants toil in the mud below, handing over sacks of grain out of fear. That's the picture. That's the version we were sold, by films, by fantasy novels, by the vague fog of the history classroom. Forget it. All of it. Because I have in front of me a document that describes exactly 1 year of owning a real manor, written down as it actually happened, and there is no keep in it. There is no army, there is no rampart, there is a pigsty, there is a malt oven, there is a bill for onions. And buried inside those onions and that pigsty is one of the coldest, most efficient money machines the English countryside ever produced. A machine so well built that the people who owned it in 1268 are, in a very literal sense, still collecting on it today. This is not a story about knights. This is a story about a claim on other people's lives, dressed up as a farm. And if you want to understand it, you have to do what the history books refuse to do. You have to stop looking at the castle and start looking at the accounts. Let me show you the accounts. The document survived by accident. It covers 1 year, from the 26th of July, 1316, to the 25th of July, 1317. Written by a clerk who was paid 2 shillings to keep the record, and 2 shillings more for keeping it well. He didn't count in months the way we do. He counted in feast days, because that's how the year was organized. So we're going to walk that year the way he did. Slowly. By the numbers. Because the numbers are where the truth is hiding, and the numbers are where they hid it. The manor is called Cuxham. It sits in Oxfordshire. And the first thing that will break your mental picture is the size. Because the size is the surprise. The entire parish was 490 acres. That's under a single square mile. Not a county, not a great estate stretching to the horizon. Under a square mile, 3 open fields of roughly 120 acres each, and in a normal year you'd sow around 269 of them. When the Domesday Commissioners came through in 1086 to inventory England for the Crown, they found here 11 tenants and 4 slaves. 200 years later, there were 23 tenants. That's it. That is the entire population of your business. 24 households. You could stand in the middle of it and see the edge of everything you owned. Now the house, and this is where nearly everyone has the wrong picture entirely. There was no keep, no walls, no garrison, nobody standing guard on anything, because there was nothing to guard against and nothing built to guard from. What sat inside the moat, and yes, there was a moat, was not a fortress, it was a farmyard. Records describe a gatehouse, a kitchen, a bakehouse, barns, cattle sheds, a stable, a cart house, a granary, a hay house, and a pigsty. 2 dovecots stood at the north end of the garden. A malt oven sat at the south, and the garden itself grew leeks, onions, beans, hemp, apples, pears, cherries, nuts, and vines. Read that list again and hold it in your head, because it's the whole illusion collapsing in real time. Cherries, nuts, vines, a malt oven, and a pigsty. You are not buying a stronghold. You are buying a working farm with a ditch dug around it to keep the water table up and the animals in. The moat wasn't for archers, it was for fish ponds and drainage. The most dangerous thing inside those walls was probably the malt oven. So if it wasn't a castle, what was it? Why would anyone want it? Why would a man in debt cling to it, and a very clever institution move heaven and earth to get its hands on it? Here's the part that changes the entire business. And I want you to sit with it, because it is the single most misunderstood fact about the medieval world. The land was not the main asset. The dirt was almost beside the point. What you actually owned when you owned Cuxham was people's obligations. 12 households owed you 2 days of labor every single week, every week of the year, forever, an obligation their children would inherit whether they liked it or not. When one of those men died, his successor had to pay you for permission to take on the land. When land changed hands at all, you took a cut of that too. You held a court, and the court itself generated income in fines. And, this is not a detail, this is the tell, you even owned the right to appoint the parish priest, the man who stood in the pulpit and told your tenants what God wanted from them. You picked him. A manor, in other words, was not a house with land around it. It was a jurisdiction with a farm attached. Say that out loud, because it rewires everything. You were not primarily a farmer. You were the holder of a set of legal rights over human beings, their labor, their inheritances, their deaths, their souls. And the farm was just the part of it you could see from the road. The crop was never the product. The people were the product. And once you understand that, you can never look at a picturesque English village the same way again. Now, somebody had to let go of this place before anybody could buy it. And we know exactly who, because this is where the follow the money begins. And it begins, as these stories so often do, with a man drowning in debt. His name was Stephen de Chanduilly. The manor had come into his family through his father, Ralph, who had married an heiress named Joan Folliot sometime before 1236. The classic medieval move, acquiring land through a marriage rather than a sword. And Stephen was no minor figure. He moved in serious company. He was a close companion of Richard of Cornwall, the king's own brother, and by some measures one of the wealthiest men in all of Europe. Stephen de Chanduilly had access, connections, proximity to the crown itself. None of it saved him, because Stephen de Chanduilly went heavily, ruinously into debt to moneylenders. And in 1268, to cover what he owed, he sold the manor and the church appointment that came with it to a man named Walter de Merton, who had been Chancellor of England. Now, one honest note, because I won't hand you a clean villain when the truth is dirtier. Records indicate that English kings in this period taxed and stripped the Jewish lenders of the realm systematically as a matter of state policy, and the debts owed to those lenders were routinely bought up and enforced by richer, better-connected men. Chanduit's personal collapse did not happen in a vacuum. It sat inside a far bigger and far uglier financial machine than one nobleman's bad arithmetic. A machine of state-sanctioned extraction that is not this episode's subject, but which you should know was humming in the background of every transaction like this one. Keep it in the corner of your eye. We'll come back to what it means that great fortunes were built on debts other people were forced into. So, a man who had everything, connections to the throne itself, sold his ancestral claim on 24 families because the ledger came due. That's the first lesson, and it's the lesson the Castle and Knight version can never teach you. The fortress that mattered was never made of stone. It was made of debt, and Chanduit lost his. But here's where it gets genuinely interesting, because Walter de Merton, the buyer, did something with Cuxham that no ordinary lord would ever do. He did not buy a farm to live on. He did not buy it to pass to a son. What he did with it in 1271, 3 years after the purchase, is the twist that turned a modest Oxfordshire farmstead into an asset that would outlive everyone who ever touched it, and keep paying out for the next 7 centuries. I'll show you exactly what he did, and why it was so ruthlessly clever, in a moment. But first, I need you to lock in the frame we're using for this entire investigation, because it's the frame the schoolbooks quietly leave out. We are not going to ask, what was it like to be a lord? That's the wrong question. It's the question that keeps you staring at the furs and the feasting and the fairy tale. We are going to ask 3 cold, modern questions instead. Who owed what to whom? Who collected? And who paid? Because when you run a medieval manor through those 3 questions, when you stop reading it as a costume drama and start reading it as a balance sheet, a very different world comes into focus. A world where a dead man's cooking pot is an income line, where the labor of a named human being could be sold off by the week like a barrel of salt, where the single best year this estate ever recorded, its most profitable 12 months in 2.5 centuries, was the exact year the people living on it were starving to death in the fields. That is not a tragic irony. That, as you're about to see, is the mechanism working precisely as it was designed to work. The people who built this system understood something we've been carefully encouraged to forget: that the surest fortune isn't the one you can spend. It's the one that renews itself every year, whether you lift a finger or not. Chanduit owned a farm and it destroyed him. Walter de Merton bought the same dirt and turned it into something that could never die. The difference between those 2 men is the difference between owning a manor and owning a claim. And it's the whole story. So let's forget the castle for good. Let's forget the knight. Let's open the ledger, follow the money, and find out what a medieval manor actually was, and who really got rich off it. Because the answer, I promise you, is not who you think. So Walter de Merton, former Chancellor of England, hands over the money, and takes the manor off a drowning man in 1268. And now you're expecting the ordinary next chapter. He moves his family in, he fixes the place up. He passes it to a son, who passes it to a grandson, and the land drifts down the generations the way land always does. None of that happens, because Walter de Merton was not thinking like a landowner. He was thinking like something far more dangerous, an institution builder. And what he did in 1271 is the move that separates the men who owned manors and lost them from the owner that has never, in 7.5 centuries, let go. He gave it away, deliberately, strategically, and in giving it away, he made it immortal. In 1271, 3 years after the purchase, Walter de Merton handed Cuxham over to a house of scholars he had personally founded 7 years earlier. He didn't do it out of pure charity, read the terms. He carved out for himself and his relatives life payments of £38, 15 shillings, drawn out of the arrangement. So he kept the cash flow for his own lifetime and his family's, and he transferred the ownership to the institution. And that house of scholars he founded, it became Merton College, Oxford. Now look at what he'd just engineered, because it's genuinely elegant and genuinely cold. From 1271 onward, this manor had exactly one customer, sitting 12 miles up the road. And its product, the thing all that wheat and wool and free labour was ultimately being converted into, was students. Cuxham existed, from that year forward, to feed Oxford scholars. The pigeons out of the dovecote, the tiered cheeses, the wheat sailing down the Thames, it was all flowing toward one table 12 miles away, forever. And here is the thing about a college that a man can never be. A man dies. A man has heirs who quarrel, who gamble, who go into debt to moneylenders exactly the way Stephen de Chanduy did. A man is mortal, and a mortal owner is a fragile owner. The whole story of Cuxham up to 1268 is the story of one family's mortality catching up with its finances. A college does not die. A college has no heirs to divide it. No gambling debts, no bad marriages, no funeral. An institution that was founded to exist in perpetuity is the perfect owner for an asset whose entire value is that it renews itself in perpetuity. Walter de Merton took an annuity, a claim that paid out year after year with no natural end date, and he matched it with the only kind of owner capable of collecting on a thing like that forever, one that was never going to die. That is the twist. A man in debt sold the manor because for a man it was a bond with the weather attached. A modest return you couldn't grow, couldn't sell quickly, and couldn't defend against a bad harvest. But for an institution that would never die, the very same manor was an annuity with no end date. The man had every reason to sell. The college had every reason to buy. Both were reading the same document correctly. They just had different lifespans. And lifespan, it turns out, is the whole game. Now, watch what an immortal owner actually does with a place, because this is where the polite version of history gets quiet. A college is not sentimental. It has no family memories tied to a particular field, no loyalty to a tenant whose grandfather served faithfully. It has accountants, and accountants restructure. Look at the tenant list over time, because the numbers tell a story nobody put in a schoolbook. Early in the 13th century, Cuxham had at least 9 free tenants, people who paid you rent in cash and otherwise owed you very little. They were, from an owner's point of view, the wrong kind of tenant. They gave you money, yes, but they didn't owe you their bodies. They could, in principle, walk away. By 1279, records show those 9 free tenants had fallen to 3. By 1297, to 2. What happened to them? Merton bought them out, one at a time, methodically, over years, and it either folded their land directly into the domain, the part it farmed for its own profit, or it relet that same land on unfree terms. Over the very same stretch of years, the number of half-yardland holdings, the unfree, labour-owing holdings, rose from 6 to 13. Sit with what that actually means, because it is one of the coldest business decisions in this entire document. The new owner went looking, specifically and deliberately, for the tenants who owed money but not labour, and replaced them with tenants who owed both. It swapped freedom for obligation as a matter of policy. It converted a rent roll into a labour pool. This is not a village evolving naturally over time. This is an institution optimizing an asset, systematically buying out the independent and multiplying the bound, because bound people were worth more to the ledger than free ones. Remember the frame, the people were the product. This is that principle in action. When Merton bought out a free tenant and re-let the land unfree, it wasn't acquiring dirt. It was upgrading a low-yield human obligation into a high-yield one. The land was incidental. The claim on the person was the whole transaction. So, what did the original money actually buy back in 1268? Let's be precise, because precision is the point. Not just the dirt. It bought the arable, the meadow, the mills, the moated farmyard, the court that generated fines, the right to name the priest, and 12 households' worth of obligations that renewed themselves every single year, whether the owner did anything at all or not. That last clause is the entire value proposition. Whether you did anything or not. You could be 12 miles away, or dead, or a corporation of scholars who'd never seen a plough, and the 2 days a week still came due, the inheritance fines still landed, the death duties still arrived, and now the question you actually came here for. What did it cost? Here I have to be honest with you rather than clever, because the honest answer is more interesting than a made-up number would be. The price does not survive. There is no document you or I can reach that records what Walter de Merton paid Stephen de Chandouille in 1268. And I'm going to say that plainly instead of inventing a figure to make the story tidier, because inventing the number would be exactly the kind of thing the schoolbook version does, smoothing over the gap in the evidence to sound authoritative. But here's what's fascinating about why the price didn't survive. Medieval people mostly did not value a manor by what it would fetch in a sale. That's a modern instinct, the flip it, sell it, capital gains instinct. They valued a manor by what it was worth yearly, by the annual yield. And that single fact tells you exactly how they thought, and it tells you why Walter de Merton's whole strategy makes sense. If you value an asset by its annual yield rather than its sale price, then the most valuable version of that asset is the one that yields forever. And the ideal owner is the one who lives forever to keep collecting the yield. The valuation method and the immortal institution strategy are the same idea wearing two different hats. For scale, and only for scale, because it's a ceiling, not a comparison, records show that in 1467, a manor together with an entire 100 sold as a package for £500. Different century, vastly bigger bundle of assets, a completely different transaction. It just gives you the outer wall of the ballpark. It does not tell you what Cuxham cost, and anyone who claims a precise 1268 price for Cuxham is guessing and hoping you won't check. Now before we get to the income, the wheat, the wool, the pigeons, the genuinely startling stuff, I need to prepare you for the shape of the money going out. Because the shape of the costs is the whole lesson, and it's a lesson that runs directly against how we imagine ruin. We think of financial disaster as a staircase. A bad year, then a worse one, then the year the debts double and the whole thing collapses in a dramatic crash. That's the movie version of going broke. That is not what a manorial account looks like. A manor's costs do not climb, they come round. Every winter, the threshing and winnowing had to be paid, around 27 shillings and sixpence across the season, handed out in pieces to 5 different men who each supervised a stretch of it. Brushwood for the hearths, 3 shillings and 6. 6 bushels of salt, 12 shillings. Hay bought in, 22 shillings and threepence, because Cuxham had almost no meadow of its own and had to import fodder from the villages down by the River Tame. And here's the merciless part. The animals eat whether or not there was a harvest. 75 quarters of mixed grain went to the pigs. Milk had to be bought in for the lambs, 4pence halfpenny, because the ewes weren't producing enough on their own. Then spring comes and the ground has to be opened, and in Easter week you buy a draft horse for 14 shillings and 4pence, because the one you have isn't enough. Early summer, 20 men are hired for 8 days to go into the standing grain and pull the bitter weeds and cut the thistles by hand, a penny a day each. Late summer is the harvest, paid by the acre. Then the buildings need re-roofing. Then the reeve goes to Henley to sell grain and claims his expenses. Then the clerk comes to write the account and eats a shilling's worth of food, and the parchment he writes on costs 12pence, recorded on that very parchment by the man who bought it. And then it is winter again. And it is the same list, That's the thing nobody tells you about owning land. There is no dramatic escalating catastrophe in a manorial account. There is no single year where the costs double and ruin you overnight. There is a list, and next year there is the same list, and the year after that it hasn't moved, and you will be dead before it changes. The total expenses for our year came to £22, 7 shillings and 9 pence halfpenny. But the number matters less than the geometry. The costs of a manor were not a staircase you might fall down. They were a circle you could never climb out of. You didn't escape them. You came back round to them every feast day, every season, every year, until you died, at which point the circle simply kept turning for whoever or whatever came next. And that is precisely why an owner who could never die was the one who won. Now, with the costs understood as a circle rather than a cliff, we can finally open the other side of the ledger, the income. Because so far this reads like a farm that just about covers itself. That's about to change. And when you see where the real money came from and whose deaths it came out of, you'll understand what Walter de Merton actually bought. So far this reads like a farm that just about breaks even. A circle of costs, a modest yield, an owner 12 miles away collecting enough to feed some scholars. If that were the whole story, nobody would have fought over Cuxham, and Stephen de Chanduy wouldn't have been ruined by losing places like it. Here is where it starts making money. And here is where the weather I asked you about at the very beginning walks onto the stage. Because our one surviving year is not a normal year. It is one of the worst years in the entire history of Northern Europe. And that is exactly why it made so much money. Start with wheat, because wheat is the obvious answer, and it's genuinely the biggest single line on the account. £15, 18 shillings and 10 pence. Half your sown acres went into it, and it travelled to Henley-on-Thames, which is to say, onto the road to London, the biggest food market in the country. Good location, careful management, so far, so ordinary. Now look at what it sold for: 6 quarters at 16 shillings each, 9 quarters at 14, 6 more at 16. Hold those numbers because you need a baseline to feel the shock. In 1313, just 3 years earlier, a quarter of wheat sold for about 5 shillings. And here it is going out the door at 14 and 16. 3 times the price, more than 3 times. That is the weather. That is the thing I told you to watch for in the very first minute. The rain came in 1315, and it did not stop. Harvests failed across Northern Europe 2 years running. Not one bad season, but 2 catastrophic ones back to back. This is the event historians call the Great Famine. People starved. Records from the period are grim in a way that's hard to read. The Sempringham analyst put wheat at 24 shillings a quarter and higher. The chroniclers at Lanercost and the Annalise went further still, claiming 40 shillings a quarter, and noting that even a single onion cost a penny. Now, a note on those chronicle figures, because I'd rather you trust me on the small things so you can trust me on the big one. Take the 40-shilling chronicle numbers as what people said at the time, the panicked, rounded-up figures of men living through a disaster, rather than audited market data. The chroniclers weren't accountants, but here's what matters. The direction is not in dispute. Nobody argues wheat prices exploded in these years. And your ledger, the Cuxham account, the audited one, the one written by a paid clerk who checked his own work, is not in dispute either. It shows wheat leaving this manor at 3 times its normal price. So say the ugly sentence plainly. Your best documented year on this manor, the single year that happened to survive, the year we can see in the most detail, is the Great Famine. The most profitable, best recorded 12 months in the story is the year the neighborhood was starving. You were selling into starvation. The failed harvest that was killing people 3 fields over is the same failed harvest that tripled the price of the grain you had managed to bring in. The people who couldn't grow enough to eat were the same people bidding the price up for the grain you were carting to Henley. Scarcity for the person who has the surplus is not a disaster. Scarcity is a margin. That is not irony. I want to be very precise about that, because how ironic is the comfortable way to file this and move on. It is not irony, it is the mechanism working exactly as designed. A system built to concentrate the surplus in one owner's hands and to sell that surplus at whatever the market will bear, will always pay out best precisely when the many have least. The manor's best year and the village's worst year were not a tragic coincidence. They were the same event, viewed from the two ends of the ledger. And wheat is only the front of the business. Keep going, because grain is the part they let you see. Livestock brought in £7, 17 shillings, and a penny halfpenny. And read what got sold, because the list is a lesson in itself. A barren cow, a second barren cow, a weak young bull, 2 sheep offloaded just before shearing because they were failing anyway. A working estate, it turns out, made money every year on schedule by disposing of its own failures. Nothing was wasted, not even disappointment. The cow that couldn't calve wasn't a loss. It was a line of income, sold at the right moment before it cost you more to keep than it would fetch. Then the cheese, and here's where the operation reveals how sophisticated it really was. Grated cheese brought in 36 shillings and 6. But look at how it was priced. 17 of the top grade, the fourth form, at 4p each. 73 of the third grade at 3p, 29 of the second grade at 2p. That's a tiered product line. Premium, mid and budget cheese, graded and priced accordingly. In the year 1317, in a village of 24 households. This is not peasants muddling along. This is market segmentation. Somebody sorted that cheese by quality and set 3 price points, because that's how you extract maximum revenue from a herd of cows. Manor produce as a whole came to 47 shillings and 3p. 5.5 stone of wool at 6 shillings a stone. 308 eggs sold 16 to the penny. 80 pigeons out of a dovecote that, in a good year, put somewhere between 500 and 1,500 young birds on the college table. Diversified income, every stream metered, every surplus converted to cash. And then, in the middle of that same list of produce, 3 entries that should stop you cold. 2 shillings for the works of Richard Est, sold in the winter. 2 shillings and 6p for the works of Adam Bryan. 15p for the works of Joanna Bonnichurch. Read those again. Those are not goods. Those are not cheese or wool or eggs. The works of Richard Est means the labour Richard Est owed the manor, his obligation, his days of work, and the manor is selling it. For cash. To someone else. Understand what that means, because it is one of the most revealing lines in the entire document. If you didn't happen to need Richard Est in your field that particular week, you were not obliged to release him from his duty. You could take that week of his labour a named living human being owed you, and sell it to a neighbour who did need the hands, and book the proceeds. 2 shillings for Richard Est's week. 15p for Joanna Bonnichurch's. Work owed was not merely an input to the farm, it was a tradable asset. It could be bought, sold, transferred, priced. A person's obligation had a market value independent of the person, and the owner could liquidate it at will. Go back to the frame, the people were the product, and here it is, stated in the ledger in the plainest possible terms. Not a metaphor, a line item. The labour of 3 named human beings converted to coin in a single winter. And now the part that isn't farming at all. The part that tells you what this business truly was underneath the crops. Fixed rents, 38 shillings and 11p. The mills, 53 shillings and 4p. 40 from the watermill, 13 and 4 from the fulling mill.
Steady on now.
Court fees, 3 and 7, and then the line that gives the whole game away. Fines of land and heriot, 72 shillings. Let me unpack that, because it's where the mask comes off. Thomas Cannon paid 40 shillings for permission to take up the land that had belonged to Adam at Heather. William Burden paid 30 shillings for permission to take up Robert White's. You didn't inherit land freely here. You paid the lord for the right to step into a dead or departed tenant's holding. The transfer of land between ordinary people was itself a taxable event, and the owner sat at the toll gate. And then there's heriot, a death duty. When a tenant died, the manor took its cut of his goods. When Adam at Heather died, the manor took his copper cooking pot. It is written down. A dead man's cooking pot, carried out of his house, sold on, and entered into the lord's income at 2 shillings. Sit with that image for a moment, because it captures this entire system better than any lecture could. A man dies, and before his family has finished grieving, someone from the manor walks into the house and carries out the pot he cooked in. Not because it's valuable, it's worth 2 shillings, but because the right to take it was part of what the owner had purchased back in 1268. Death itself was a revenue event. Now do the arithmetic that should genuinely bother you. One tenant, Adam at Heather, died during this single accounting year. His successor paid 40 shillings to take on the land. His cooking pot sold for 2. That's 42 shillings out of one man's death. And what did it cost to pay every single permanent servant on this entire estate for 12 months? 16 shillings. The whole staff, all year. One tenant dying was worth nearly 3 times your entire annual payroll. Let that reorder your sense of the whole enterprise. The farm, the ploughing, the sowing, the whole visible business of agriculture was almost beside the point next to the value of a single death. The people weren't there to work the land so much as the land was there to hold the people in place so their inheritances, their transfers and their deaths could be taxed. The crop was the cover story, the obligation was the business. But there's one more income stream, and it's the biggest of all. And you will never find it anywhere in this account because it never got paid for. 12 villain households, tenants who were not free to leave, owed 2 days of labor a week, every week permanently, and their children inherited the obligation. The college's own historians have valued that unpaid work at £6 to £7 a year against a gross income of around £60. Close to a tenth of this entire business arrived as labor for which nobody ever wrote a single line of payment. That is precisely why you'll never find it in an expenses column. It cost the owner nothing. It appears in the accounts only as an absence, a cost you simply never had to incur, a tenth of your income arriving for free, forever, because the people providing it were bound to the land and could not say no. The farm was the visible part, the obligation was the business, and the most valuable input in the whole operation, that £6 to £7 of free human labor, was the one input that cost nothing, appeared nowhere, and, as we're about to see, was the one thing in the entire machine that could not be replaced. Hold on to that, because it's about to become the crack that brings the whole thing down. Here's the thing you have to correct in your mental picture before we go any further, because it's the last comfortable illusion left standing. You are imagining the lord of the manor at the top of the pyramid, the apex, the man everything flows up to. He wasn't. You weren't. You were the middle of the arrangement. Money and labor and grain flowed up to you from below, and then a great deal of it flowed straight past you, upward, to men who had never set eyes on the place. To understand a medieval manor is to understand that its owner was a toll collector standing halfway up a much taller structure, taking a cut on the way through. Both directions matter. Let's take the one below you first, because it's where the raw power of the thing lives. Your tenants were not allowed to grind their own grain. Read that again, because it's the mechanism the whole rural economy quietly turned on. They could not grind their own wheat into their own flour to make their own bread. They had to bring it to your mill. The miller took a share of the grain itself, up to a tenth of it, and then the lord took a cut on top of that. You were not selling flour, you were charging a toll on something every single household had to do in order to eat. There is no more captive market than hunger, and the mill sat astride it. This wasn't incidental to manorial wealth, it was central to it. Domesday itself records estates studded with mills, 3 watermills on an estate of just 5 hides in one case, which is an enormous amount of machinery for a small place, and it tells you exactly where the money was. Milling was infrastructure, and infrastructure was monopoly, and monopoly was the point. Merton understood this perfectly. It held the mill rights over the north of the parish, and in 1312 the college built a fulling mill from scratch and rented it out at 13 shillings and 4pence a year. Real capital, deliberately spent, to widen the monopoly it already held. That's not a college dabbling in agriculture. That's an institution investing in its choke points. But, and this is the flaw in the model, the crack of light, Merton did not own every somewhere. The mill at the east end of the village had been given to Wallingford Priory long before Merton ever arrived, and it stayed in other hands for centuries. So you owned the right to make your tenants grind somewhere. You did not own every somewhere. The monopoly had a seam in it. Keep that seam in mind, because incomplete monopolies are how ordinary people found the smallest room to breathe. Now, how hard was this milling monopoly actually enforced? Because on paper, you must use my mill sounds almost quaint. In practice, it was enforced with a ferocity that should end any lingering romance about the manorial world. And for that, we leave Cuxham for a moment and go to St. Albans. Not because this is what Merton did, but because it shows you the mechanism running at full, undisguised strength. In 1274, the abbot of St. Albans, who held the milling rights over the entire town, sent his bailiffs house to search for handmills, the small querns families used to grind grain privately at home, and to seize them, everyone they could find. The townspeople, understandably, took the abbot to court over it, and they lost. Not only did they lose the right to grind their own grain, they were ordered to pay the abbot 100 marks for the offence of having defamed him by objecting. And then the abbot did something that tells you everything about the psychology of this power. He had the confiscated millstones, the seized querns, the stones his tenants had used to feed their own families, set into the floor of his private parlour, and he walked on them, every day, a floor made of his subjects' surrendered independence under his feet. The town did not forget. More than a century later, in 1381, during the Great Rising that swept England, the townspeople of St. Albans broke into the abbey and dug his floor up. They went back for the stones. That is how long a memory like that lasts, and how bitter. 100 years, and they came back for the millstones. Now, St. Albans was a far bigger, far more aggressive lordship than a college sitting on 400 acres in Oxfordshire. I'm not telling you Merton set stones in a floor and danced on them. I'm showing you the engine at full throttle so you understand what the milling toll on the Cuxham account actually represented. Every one of those 40 shillings from the watermill was a slice of that same power. The power to stand between a family and its own bread and charge for passage. Merton ran a gentler version of it, but it was the same machine. That's the direction below you. Now the direction above you, which is less fun because it's where you discover you're not the top of anything. Tithes came off everything, and they were itemized to the point of comedy. Tithe on 7 calves sold, tithe on 3 calves still walking around alive, tithe on 1 lamb, tithe on 4 skins. The church took its tenth of the living and the dead, the sold and the unsold, right down to individual animals, and the accountant dutifully recorded every fraction. There was no corner of the operation the tithe didn't reach into. And then the crown. 28 shillings for a tax called the 16th penny. 6 shillings and 8 pence to the collectors who came to gather it. And, this detail is almost too perfect, their bread and cheese and ale while they sat in your hall doing it. You didn't just pay the king's tax. You fed the king's tax collectors while they took it. They ate at your table on their way through, and you wrote down what they ate. So look at the whole shape of it now. You collected from everyone below you, the milling toll, the rents, the inheritance fines, the death duties, the free labour. And then you turned around and paid upward, to the church and the crown, to men and institutions that had never seen Cuxham and never would. You were a pressure point in a system that ran from the family grinding grain at the bottom all the way to the king at the top, and your profit was simply the difference between what you squeezed out of the level below and what the levels above squeezed out of you. That's what it meant to own a manor. Not to sit at the summit, to sit in the middle of a very long chain of extraction, and to survive on the margin between the pull from below and the pull from above. Now I want to come back to that 6 to 7 pounds of free labour, the 12 villain households owing 2 days a week, because there's one more thing to say about it before we get to what destroyed all of this, and it's the single most important observation in the whole investigation. It was the cheapest input in the entire business. It cost nothing. It appeared in no expenses column. It arrived for free, every week, forever. And it was the only input that could not be replaced. Sit with that, because it's the pattern that runs through every ledger like this one, the cheapest line turning out to be the fatal one. Everything else on this estate was substitutable. If a horse died, you bought another horse at Easter for 14 shillings. If the water wheel broke, you spent 3 shillings and 10 pence on timber and nails and rebuilt it. If a barn roof failed, you hired a man and his helper for 22 days at 6 pence a day and re-roofed it. Capital could be replaced, buildings could be replaced, animals could be replaced. There was always another one to buy. But the free labour was not a resource in that sense. It looked like a resource. It sat in the accounts, or rather it sat in the meaningful absence in the accounts, like just another asset. But it wasn't machinery you could repurchase. It was 12 families, 12 specific households of specific people bound to the land, whose bodies performed the work and whose children were born into the same obligation. The value wasn't the labor in the abstract. The value was that these particular people existed and were tied to this particular ground and could not leave. And that is the fragility hiding at the very heart of the machine. The fragility that the 2.5 centuries of smooth, circular, unspectacular accounts had completely concealed. By the 1330s, this looked like a machine that could not fail. It had already been running for 250 years. The costs came round in their circle. The obligations renewed themselves. The tithes and taxes flowed up. The milling tolls and death duties flowed in. And a college that would never die sat 12 miles away collecting an annuity with no end date. What could possibly stop a thing like that? Not a war. Cuxham was too small to fight over. Not a bad heir. The college had no heirs. Not a king seizing it. It was already paying the king his 16th penny like clockwork. The thing that stopped it was arithmetic. Because here's what the whole system depended on and never once had to think about: the continued existence of the 12 families. The entire structure, the free labor, the inheritance fines, the death duties that were worth 3 times the payroll, the milling toll on people who had to eat. Every last stream of income assumed that there would always be people. Bound people, renewing themselves generation after generation, inheriting the obligation, walking their grain to your mill, owing you their 2 days a week. The land was permanent. The barns were permanent. The mill was permanent. The one thing that was not permanent, the one input that could vanish and could never be repurchased at any price, was the people. And nobody in 250 years of careful, circular, double-checked accounting had ever had to reckon with what happened if the people simply stopped being there. They were about to find out, because the machine had a single point of failure, and it wasn't in the fields or the mill or the moated farmyard. It was in the assumption baked into every free line of labor that the 12 families would always be 12 families. Remove that assumption, remove the people, not the land, not the buildings, the people, and the entire 2.5-century annuity doesn't decline gracefully. It falls through the floor. All the wealth that had flowed from human obligation for a quarter of a millennium turns out to have been resting on nothing sturdier than the continued heartbeat of 24 households. In early 1349, something arrived at Cuxham that had no interest whatsoever in the terms of anyone's tenancy, and it went straight for the one thing the owner could never replace. The plague reached Cuxham in early 1349. I want to tell this part carefully, because it is where the whole cold machine we've been dismantling finally meets something colder, and because the temptation here is to reach for drama the moment deserves and doesn't need. The numbers are the drama. Let me just give you the numbers. All 12 villains died that year. All of them. The 12 households, the ones who owed the 2 days a week, the free labor worth £6 to £7 a year, the input that could not be replaced, every one of them, gone in a single year. 4 of the 8 cottagers were dead by 1352, and 9 of the parish's 13 half-yard land holdings were sitting empty, with nobody left alive to work them. Remember what those 13 half-yard land holdings were. We watched Merton build them, buying out the free tenants one at a time, converting freedom into obligation, raising the count from 6 to 13 because bound labor was worth more to the ledger than cash rent. That was the optimization. That was the clever restructuring an immortal owner performed on its asset over decades. And in 3 years, 9 of those 13 were empty. The very holdings the college had most carefully engineered into existence were the ones that emptied out, because they were the ones packed with the bound people the plague came for. The optimization and the vulnerability were the same thing. Merton had spent decades concentrating its wealth into human obligation, into the bodies of specific bound families, precisely because that was the most valuable, cheapest, most reliable form the asset could take. And that concentration is exactly what made 1349 a catastrophe rather than a setback. If Cuxham had still been a place of free tenants paying cash rent, the deaths would have been a tragedy, but not a structural collapse. The land could be re-let. But Merton hadn't built a rent roll. It had built a labour pool, and a labour pool is only worth anything if the labourers are alive. And one of the dead was the man whose year we have been reading this entire time. Not his handwriting exactly. A clerk did the actual writing, the man paid 2 shillings and 2 more for doing it well. But the year was his. His name was Robert Oldman, and he was the reeve of Cuxham from 1311 to 1349. 38 years running this manor for the college. Stop on Robert Oldman for a moment, because he is the human centre of this whole story, and the schoolbook version has no room for him at all. He was not born to any of this. He was a villain's younger son, bound, low, at the very bottom of the structure we've been mapping. He got his half-yard land by marrying into it. And from that starting point, a bound man's second son with no land of his own, he climbed over the years to managing the entire estate. He ran the domain, oversaw the ploughing and the harvest, and the sale of grain at Henley, kept the whole operation turning for 38 years. And remember how the reeve was paid, which is to say, wasn't. He drew no salary. His compensation was that his own rent simply stopped being collected. So the man who actually ran your entire operation appears in the accounts not as a wage, but as an absence, a line of income the owner chose not to take. For 38 years, Robert Oldman was Cuxham, in every practical sense, and for 38 years he shows up in the ledger mainly as a rent that wasn't charged. His goods were listed in 1349, and the inventory is a life, a full set of farm tools, 67 sheep, 35 pounds of wool, malt, mixed grain, 5 horses, an ox, a few cows and pigs. That is what a bound man's younger son had accumulated across a lifetime of running someone else's estate, a respectable, comfortable, hard-won holding. 67 sheep is not nothing. It is in fact a small triumph, the visible result of 38 years of competence. His service ends in 1349. The inventory is dated 1349. The record does not tell us how he died, and I am not going to guess for you, because guessing would cheapen it and because the account itself doesn't. The dates are enough. The man who kept the year we've been reading did not survive the year the plague came. Now, here is the fragility laid bare, and it is horribly mathematically simple. The land was untouched, every acre of it, exactly as fertile as before. The barns were fine, nobody burned them. The mill still turned. The moated farmyard, the dovecots, the malt oven, all of it stood exactly as it had. Not one physical asset on the entire estate was damaged. And 6 to 7 pounds a year of free labour simply vanished, because it had never really been a resource at all. It had been 12 families, and the families were gone. That is the whole lesson of this episode compressed into a single fact. For 2.5 centuries, the accounts had listed the physical world as the assets, the land, the buildings, the animals, the mill, and treated the human obligation as a kind of permanent background condition, a free tenth of income you never had to think about. And when the test finally came, it turned out to be exactly backwards. The physical assets, every one of which the ledger dutifully valued, all survived and were worth nothing without people to work them. The one input the ledger never recorded because it cost nothing, the people, was the only thing that had ever mattered. The land was never the asset. It never had been. The claim on human beings was the asset, and the human beings were dead. Watch what the immortal owner does now, because this is where its supposed strength curdles. A college cannot die. That was the whole genius of Walter de Merton's design. But a college also cannot conjure people. Merton could not find a reliable reeve afterward. The Robert Oldmans of the world, the competent, bound, ambitious men who ran these estates for the price of an uncollected rent, were dead, and the survivors had suddenly discovered something the plague had taught the whole of England at once, that living hands were now scarce, and scarce things command a price. For the first time in its history, Merton had to start paying for what it used to be simply owed. Read that as the reversal it is. The entire value proposition of Cuxham, the reason a man in debt sold it and an immortal institution bought it, was that a tenth of the income arrived as free labour that renewed itself forever without a wage. That was the annuity. That was the machine. And in 1349, the machine broke, not because the land failed or the buildings burned, but because the free labour stopped being free. The survivors could now walk. They could now bargain. They could now name a wage, because there were finally more empty holdings than hands to fill them. And here is the part where the powerful did exactly what the powerful do when the arithmetic turns against them. They tried to legislate reality away. The Crown issued an ordinance in 1349, and then the Statute of Labourers in 1351, which made it illegal to pay a worker more than the wages that had prevailed in 1346, before the plague. Think about the breathtaking cheek of that. Half the workforce is dead. The survivors are worth more because there are fewer of them. That is simply what scarcity means. It is the same law that tripled the price of wheat in the famine we read about, the same law working in labour that had worked in grain. And the response of the ruling institutions was to pass a law declaring that the price of a human being's work was fixed at its pre-catastrophe level, by royal command. Watch three threads converge here. Money as first cause. The whole crisis is a labour price shock, an arithmetic problem, not a moral or political one. The illusion of inevitability. There was nothing inevitable about the statute. It was a choice, a specific decision by a specific narrow circle to protect landholders' margins at the expense of the survivors. And the critique of elites. The statute is the pure form of privatize the gains, socialize the losses. When scarcity raised the price of grain, the owners kept every penny of the windfall. When scarcity raised the price of labour, the same class of owners passed a law to deny the workers theirs. The market was sacred when it filled the Lord's purse, and illegal the moment it filled the labourers. And did it work? No. Of course it didn't. You cannot legislate away arithmetic. Records show unskilled farm wages ran around 2 to 3 pence a day in the 1340s, and by 1400 they had roughly doubled to 4 to 6 pence a day. The law said one thing, the shortage of living bodies said another, and the bodies won, slowly, over decades, because reality always outlasts the statute written to deny it. The most an ordinance could do was slow the transfer and criminalize the survivors' advantage. It could not restore the dead, and it could not restore the free labor that had died with them. You can see the collapse in the buildings themselves, which is where a story like this stops being a spreadsheet and becomes visible in the ground. 2 homesteads at the northwest end of the village were abandoned in 1349 and never taken up again. Never. And Robert Oldman's own family tenement, the holding that bound man's son had climbed a lifetime to secure, east of the rectory, was recorded as a bare plot with nothing standing on it by the 1480s. The 67 sheep, the 5 horses, the 38 years of competence, and within a century and a half, his family's own ground was an empty rectangle in a survey. That is what the failure of the free labour machine looked like at human scale. Not a dramatic ruin, but grass growing over the place where a household used to be. And now watch the numbers fall, because the descent is the verdict. The manor had cleared just over £40 net in a good year before the plague. Profit dropped to £10, 13 shillings by 1354. In 1359, this is the moment the immortal owner finally admits defeat on its own terms. The college gave up farming Cuxham altogether and simply leased it out. The rector took it on in 1361 for £20 a year. By 1377, there were 38 adults left in the entire parish, about a third of what there had been. Nobody seized this manor, nothing burned, no army came. The wheel simply ran out of people to turn it, and Merton, the owner that could never die, never put its own hands back on it again. The land, remember, was untouched the whole time. That was never the point. The point was the people, and the people were gone. And an asset built entirely on a claim over other people's lives is worth precisely as much as those lives continue. In 1349, they stopped continuing. And 2.5 centuries of flawless, circular, self-renewing accounts came to rest on the one line the accounts had never bothered to write down. Which leaves us with the reckoning. Could you actually have gotten rich owning one of these things? And who, across all 7 centuries, actually won? Because the answer to that is where the whole investigation finally pays out. And it is not, I promise you, the man in the furs. So, could you have gotten rich owning a medieval manor? Let's not answer with a feeling. Let's answer with the ledger, because we've earned the right to. Run 2 years side by side and convert them not with some historian's guesswork, but with the manor's own prices, so the number means something you can feel. In a good year before the plague, Cuxham grossed around £60, counting the rents and the court money and everything else. Once you subtract the costs, the circle of costs, the salt and the hay and the draught horse and the re-roofing, and once you count the food eaten on the estate itself, it cleared just over £40 net. On under 500 acres. Now what is £40? This same account pays a weeder a penny a day. There are 240 pence in a pound. So £40 is 9,600 days of that man's labour. If he worked every single working day of the year, you would need him for roughly 30 years to earn what this manor cleared in one. That's the scale. 1 year of owning Cuxham equaled a working lifetime of the man pulling weeds in its fields. That sounds like wealth. Hold it against the other year, the famine year we've been reading. Receipts of £48, 17 shillings, 4pence and 3 farthings. Expenses of £22, 7 and 9pence halfpenny. Leaving £26, 9 shillings and 7pence halfpenny owed to the Lord at the end of it. And now say the ugly part out loud one final time, because it's the whole argument of this film in a single sentence. Those receipts are high because wheat was at 3 times its normal price. And wheat was at 3 times its price because the harvest had failed and people were starving to death in the surrounding fields. The manor's best year and the neighbourhood's worst year were the same year. That is not irony. That is the mechanism working exactly as it was designed to work. A system built to concentrate, the surplus will always pay its owner best in the season the many have least. And then the bad year, the one after the plague, £10, 13 shillings in 1354. Then the permanent retreat to a £20 lease. By 1535, 2 centuries later, the college was taking £8 from the man farming the domain and £8 14 and 6 from the other tenants. About £15 net, roughly a third of what the place had cleared 2 centuries earlier. It never came back. Not in 50 years, not in 100, not in 200. The machine broke in 1349 and it simply ran, forever after, at a fraction of what it had been. One thing you're owed before the verdict, because I'd rather you distrust me than believe a flattering lie. Cuxham is not a typical manor. It is the best documented small manor in all of England. And it was an unusually good one. High yields, fertile soil, careful management, and a river route straight to the biggest food market in the country. Historians call £40 a large sum for an estate that size, which is really just another way of saying that most estates that size never got there. What we've been reading is close to a best case. The ordinary version of it was a good deal worse. So when I answer the question, understand I'm answering it at the top of the range. Could you have gotten rich? Look at the 3 men who actually touched this manor and where each of them ended up. That's your answer, written in 3 lives. Stephen de Chanduilly was born to it, companion of the king's own brother, one of the best connected men in England. And he sold it to cover debts he could not pay, and vanishes from the story a ruined man. Wealth at the start, wealth by inheritance, wealth by connection, and it did not save him. The manor was a bond with the weather attached, and the weather, or the debt, or both, came due. Robert Oldman was born a villain's younger son, the very bottom of the structure. He married into half a yard land, climbed to run the whole estate for 38 years, and died in the plague owning 67 sheep and 35 pounds of wool. A real achievement, a comfortable life clawed out of a bound beginning. And within a century and a half, his family's own plot of ground was recorded as bare earth with nothing on it. Comfort, yes. Wealth, no. And nothing that lasted. And Merton College never put a single hand to the soil, and still owns the ground. That's your verdict, and it is mostly no. A manor threw off a reliable, unspectacular return that you could not grow, could not sell quickly, and could not defend against weather or disease. It made institutions wealthy and individuals merely comfortable. For a man, it was a bond with the weather attached. For an institution that was never going to die, it was an annuity with no end date, which is exactly why the man sold and the college bought. They read the same document correctly. They just had different lifespans, and lifespan was the whole game. Now walk the timeline out to its end, because the end is genuinely staggering. In 1268, Stephen de Chanduilly sold this manor because he owed money he could not pay. In 1316, the rain came, the harvest failed, and the wheat in his old fields sold for 3 times what wheat was worth. In 1349, every villain in the village died. In 1359, the college stopped farming it and rented it out to somebody else. And in 2012, read that year again, 2012, Merton College still owned 429 acres of Cuxham. The whole parish, apart from a little land in the north. 744 years out of a single purchase. You never really owned a manor. You held it for a while, and then it went on without you. The land was never the asset, and the crop was never the product. What Walter de Merton actually bought in 1268 was a claim on other people's years. 2 days a week, a payment when they inherited, a pot when they died. And the only owner who could ever truly collect on a claim like that was one that was never going to die. That's the real lesson, and it's the one they don't teach, because the pattern didn't end in 1268, and it didn't end in 2012. Look at the shape of it. The people who win over the long run are not the ones who own the biggest asset or hold the highest title. They're the ones structured to never die, to collect the small renewing claim decade after decade through every famine and plague and crash, while the individuals around them are ruined by debts and weather and time. Chanduit had the title and the connections and lost everything. Merton had the structure, and 744 years later it was still collecting. The furs and the feasting were never where the power was. The power was in owning a claim that outlived every person subject to it. And if that sounds like the medieval past, look harder. The claim that renews itself whether you lift a finger or not. The windfall privatized when scarcity fills your purse, and the law rewritten to deny others their share when scarcity fills theirs. The institution that survives every crisis precisely because it cannot die, quietly accumulating while individuals are wiped out around it. That is not a story about moats and dovecots. That is the architecture of wealth in every century, including this one. The costs still come round in a circle. The best years for those who own the surplus are still, too often, the worst years for everyone else, and the winners are still, overwhelmingly, the ones built never to die. We've been taught to picture the medieval world as knights and castles because it's a comfortable story. It stays safely in the past, and it flatters us that we've moved on. Follow the money instead, and you find something that hasn't moved on at all. You find a claim on other people's years, dressed up as a farm, owned by an institution that outlasted the Black Death, the Reformation, the Industrial Revolution, and every human being who ever worked its soil. That's not history. That's a mechanism, and it's still running. So before you go, 3 things. First, I want a real answer from you, not a shrug. When Walter de Merton bought this manor in 1268 and handed it to a college he'd founded so it could collect forever, did he know exactly what he was building? An immortal claim on other people's lives that would outlast every soul subject to it? Or was he just a clever man doing what clever men of his time did, a product of the system he was born into? Comment below. Type yes if you think he knew precisely what he was doing. Type no if you think he was just a product of his age. I read these, and I'll tell you where I land in the next one. Second, send this to one person. You know someone who still thinks a medieval manor was a castle with a knight on the wall, someone who still pictures history as kings and battles instead of ledgers and claims. Send them this. It might change how they see not just the past, but everything happening right now. Every renewing claim, every privatized windfall, every institution that survives what individuals cannot. And third, next week. I've been reading these manorial accounts for years, and I kept finding the same shape in ledger after ledger, from Pompeii to Genoa, the cheapest line in the book turning out to be the fatal one. Next week, I'll put one specific document in front of you, an internal account, dated within a year of a collapse everyone blamed on bad luck, that proves the owners could see the failure coming in their own numbers, line by line, and chose to do nothing but keep collecting until the wheel ran out of people to turn it. They wrote it down themselves. I'll show you the page. The land was never the asset, the crop was never the product, and the claim never dies. I'll see you next week.